This episode of Principal Center Radio is brought to you by the Project-Based Learning Network. Dr. Amy Bader, the director, is a professional curriculum writer and the leading expert on standards-based PBL. She trains teachers how to write high-quality PBL units in the Project-Based Learning Curriculum Developer Certification Program, and she teaches leaders how to implement successful PBL initiatives in the Project-Based Learning Instructional Leader Program. Learn more at principalcenter.com/PBL.
Welcome to Principal Center Radio, helping you build capacity for instructional leadership. Here's your host, Director of the Principal Center, Dr. Justin Bader.
Welcome, everyone, to Principal Center Radio. I'm your host, Justin Bader, and I'm honored to welcome to the program Dr. Adam Tyner. Adam Tyner, Ph.D., is National Research Director at the Thomas B. Fordham Institute. Dr. Tyner served as Senior Quantitative Analyst at Hanover Research and has taught English as a second language in China and California, and taught courses at the University of California, San Diego. His research and commentary have appeared and been cited in national and international media such as The Economist, Forbes, BBC, NBC, The New York Times, Education Week, Education Next, and Diplomat. And his scholarly work has appeared in outlets such as Economics of Education Review and Journal of East Asian Studies. And he is an executive editor of the Oklahoma Education Journal. Dr. Tyner holds a Ph.D. in political science from the University of California, San Diego, where he completed his doctoral dissertation on the integration of rural to urban migrant workers in China's cities. And he is the co-author with David Griffith of the new report, Equitable Grading Through the Eyes of Teachers.
And now, our feature presentation.
Adam, welcome to Principal Center Radio.
Great to be with you, Justin.
I'm excited to talk about this report because you actually commissioned a large and nationally representative survey of teachers about so-called equitable grading practices. Talk to us a little bit about why you commissioned this survey through the RAND Corporation and maybe why equitable is in quotation marks.
Well, there have been a lot of grading reforms that people have talked about over the last few years that have been branded as equitable grading reforms. The truth is, people have been debating grading policy since the dawn of time. I mean, you go back 100 years or more, even more than that, and you'll find people talking about how grades are not consistent or they're not fair or pointing out different kinds of problems with them. And so in recent years, we've heard advocates suggest that we should reform grading practices, and they've done so under the banner of equity. Frankly, some of the things that they have suggested we change about grades are ideas that are not really very new and sometimes tenuously connected to equity, but that has been kind of the branding for the last few years, and so that's why we use that term, equitable grading practices, quote unquote, in the title of the report. But while we've heard about that from anecdotes around the country and a lot of controversy that's been surrounding some of the discussions of reforming grading policy, we haven't really known how widespread these policies were or how teachers felt about them. And so we wanted to do this study to really learn that. And, the grading reforms that people have debated, there's just a lot of different dimensions to them. And I wrote a policy brief on this last year with my colleague Meredith Coffey, where we looked at a bunch of different dimensions of grading practices and grading policies. And there are some that have to do with, making grading anonymous, for example. The underlying issue is that there is evidence that there's bias in grading and bias against Black students, for example, bias against different types of students. And so there are people who want to try to make grading better and make it fairer. But there are a bunch of different policies and practices that have gone under this rubric, equitable grading. We hear about places where students need to bring school supplies to school and they get extra credit for that or something. And so that's going into their grade. That's something that reformers often bring up as something that's kind of obviously inequitable, obviously not connected to whether you learned anything in school, and therefore something that we should get rid of. But there's been a bunch of other policies and practices that they've suggested, such as getting rid of deadlines or policies around changing the grading scale, for example, making it go from 50 to 100. So you automatically get 50% regardless of what you did, or if you didn't even turn in the assignment, or changing the grading scale in other ways to make it more lenient or make it easier for students to pass. And some of those have been really controversial. And so the point of this policy paper that we put out of this new study and the survey of teachers is to find out how widespread is this stuff and what do teachers actually think of it. And we really focused on some of the most controversial policies that have come out around that, just because we had kind of limited bandwidth in our survey.
Right. And you focused on 5 in the end. Tell us what those 5 practices are that you asked about in the survey.
Right. So there, like I said, are a bunch of dimensions to this and a bunch of different things people have advocated for. We really wanted to focus on the ones that had gotten the most attention in the media, that people have been talking about in school board meetings. And I mean, we just wanted to talk about the ones that had kind of generated the most interest, given the kind of limited bandwidth we had in the survey. And so we talked about 5 policies. Those 5 policies were the kind of no zeros policy, where some people call it minimum grading, where students are assigned a grade of, for example, at least 50% on any assignment. That was one policy we asked about. We also asked about eliminating late penalties, which gives their students the right to turn in their assignments without any kind of penalty. Also, we asked about retake policies, particularly allowing students to continue retaking tests and quizzes without any penalty. We also asked about homework and graded homework, like removing all grades around homework, which is one thing that the advocates have suggested. And we also talked about eliminating grades for participation. Those were the 5 practices that we focused on in this report. But I should say that, grading reformers suggest a lot of different types of things. We were able to focus on these in this study. But there are other policies related to equitable grading, things like using rubrics or anonymized grading, or there's other aspects of this. And we didn't ask about everything, but we did ask about those 5 policies.
And certainly there's room for critique in traditional grading. There are plenty of practices out there that are common that, deserve some scrutiny, deserve some critique. As you said, bringing school supplies in for a grade does not necessarily make a lot of sense and is not equitable. And being equitable is a legitimate concern, right? It's a real thing. We're not downplaying the importance of equitable practices, but we're also saying that simply calling a practice equitable doesn't fix problems with it. And teachers seem to have a pretty deep firsthand understanding of what some of those problems are. And of the 5 that you talk about in the report, only one of them had kind of a net positive score, and that was retakes. So teachers, maybe do like the idea of allowing students to retake assignments to improve their grade. What was the least popular policy of all that you studied?
The least popular of the 5 was the no zeros policy, or minimum grading, assigning students points for assignments that they didn't even turn in, I think is how we put it in the question. And that had a very negative rating among teachers. Very few teachers think that that's a good idea. And many, many teachers, the vast majority of teachers, I think it's over 80% of teachers, are against that type of policy. Actually, all of the policies are, like you said, that we asked about, all of those policies are kind of underwater with teachers, meaning more teachers said that they were harmful to student engagement than said that they were helpful to student engagement, except for the unlimited retake policy. And the unlimited retake policy was really kind of split. It was a net 4%, which really means that teachers are pretty split about that one. And other ones, like I think the getting rid of deadlines, no late penalties, that's 33 points underwater with teachers. Getting rid of participation, 46% underwater with teachers. Getting rid of homework grades, 19% underwater with teachers.
So the 50% minimum grade policies, or the no zero policies, seem pretty straightforwardly bad, and certainly to the majority of teachers seem pretty bad. And you say that by definition, those are a way of lowering academic expectations and inflating grades. Like there's no way around the fact that we're giving students points for work they didn't do. In your thinking, what's the Steelman case for those policies? Because I've heard advocates say, well, the zero has too big a penalty on the grade, and this is just a way of correcting that outsized penalty. From your experience talking with people and reading about these policies and the case behind them, what are they really going for here that has made these policies so popular? Because with teachers, they're not popular, and yet they're all over the place.
Yeah, and our survey also asked about how common these policies were. 27% of teachers said that there was some kind of minimum grading going on in their school or district, that was the policy in their school or district that was practicing some kind of no zeros or minimum grading policy. I think it's interesting you asked for the Steelman case. I was thinking about that a little bit. And I think that the argument is something like that, a grade of 0 could, they use the word catastrophic. Sometimes it creates this, that's so bad for your grade that you can't recover from it, something like that. But I really think that that's probably based on a straw man vision of holistic grading and how most teachers work, because I have never encountered a syllabus or a teacher or a class where there was some assignment early in the year that you couldn't make up and that it was so big a part of your grade that if you missed it, you would fail the class. That's just not something that I've ever encountered. You can tell me you work with lots of schools. If you've ever encountered that on a syllabus, most teachers are attuned to the idea that there's a balancing act here and some trade-offs when it comes to how much you should front load or back load the grading in a term, because you want it to be reflective of a bunch of different things. Ideally, this grade could be reflective of the student's really mastery of everything at the end of the term. But we also know that the students, at least most people agree, that the student needs some shorter term objectives as well. And so how to weight all of those is something that teachers grapple with. And it's fair to talk about those trade-offs, but I'm not aware of any teacher who was out there saying, like, you missed this assignment the third week and now you're going to fail the course and we're not going to let you retake it or something. It could mean that you won't get an A in the course. That's true. But I'm not aware. I think it's kind of a straw man, vision of holistic grading to think that we can't have any kind of, grading early on that affects your final grade without being this really detrimental thing for students.
Yeah, and it seems like there's a little bit of a trade-off there, because certainly it is a real thing to get discouraged, right? Like if you didn't do any work for the first 3/4 of the semester, like you're pretty far behind, you're in a pretty deep hole, and it may be difficult to dig your way out. And you could feel very discouraged if you were, certainly a lot of people have said, that was me. I just didn't do my work for months and months. And I was in a pretty deep hole. And it is hard to come back from that. But at the same time, we have to make sure that we're balancing that concern against motivation in the first place. Like if there really are no consequences for not doing any of your assignments or, for skipping the majority of your assignments, and like kids figure that out, right? Teachers know kids have figured out, hey, I don't really have to do any work after January and I can pass this class. Talk to us about your take on that.
Well, I think you said it really well, Justin. And I think this is a place where the ideas around, deadlines in the equitable grading or grading reform space have become really detached from common sense, because students obviously need some short-term objectives to reach towards. And it's like we're always looking back and saying, what about the student who, at some point, made a mistake in the past? Shouldn't there be any chance for redemption for them? And that's fine. I think we have a lot of those built into traditional grading, and it may be that we need to have another route in certain circumstances. Those are the kinds of things that teachers have to balance. But to act like we should just remove all of the short-term stuff, that is really dangerous, because procrastination is a really powerful force. And it is really one of the benefits of school to have the structure and the accountability in the short term to help you meet your longer term objectives. And that's exactly what students are depending on teachers and school for. If they want to learn something, we could say, just go to the library and learn it. It's all there, or use Khan Academy, right? But you might always feel like, that'd be easier tomorrow, or I could catch up later. And some of these policies basically say, yeah, you can do it later. It's fine. You don't really have to have any kind of short-term, you don't have to meet any short-term goals. You just have to get it by the end of the term. And that encourages students to procrastinate, to kick the can down the road. And then what happens later is that they arrive at that point in the road and they just never did it. And then there's no recovering from it. And so, yes, there is a trade-off there, and teachers need to balance this in a way that's reasonable, but they shouldn't be just blanket eliminating everything short-term. I think that's going to be a real mistake. I would say that there's some research on this as well, that students, I think I've seen a couple of papers where students were offered the opportunity, I think this was in a higher ed setting, but where they were offered the opportunity to either turn in all their assignments at the end of the term or to space them out, and they were offered the chance to penalize themselves. And like some kind of economic rational way of thinking of it is, well, you should maximize your freedom and just have it all due at the end, not impose any penalties on yourself. But students don't do that. Students are actually choose deadlines and choose to penalize themselves for not meeting them. And that's because there's a value to having that accountability in the shorter term. And if schools aren't willing to provide it, we're really doing a disservice to students. And it's almost certainly going to be bad for.
Right. And that's where sometimes our lenience, which we think of as a form of compassion, actually is not doing our students any favors, right? Like when my kids were little, we were not lenient about brushing your teeth because we wanted them to develop that habit, and it wouldn't have been compassionate to, let their teeth rot and fall out. And I think we've got to look at that responsibility that teachers have to, hold students accountable, to help them develop good habits, because it becomes a time issue, right? It's not just that you got busy last week and now you need a little bit of extra time to finish this assignment. If you're kicking the can down the road on every single assignment, that's going to be unsustainable. You're going to get to a point where you have so much late work that you can't keep up with your current work and you just never get back on track. And I think we're all tempted in that way to procrastinate, right? Like it's always more appealing in the short term. We are all subject to this short term thinking of, I'd rather have some free time now and I'll do the work later. And of course, that doesn't work out well for us. So as you said, we need those deadlines. And from an equity standpoint, schools need to provide that structure because that's a lot of our technology, right? Students, as you said, could learn on their own. Well, they mostly don't. The books are not scarce. The information is not scarce. You could learn any subject in school just on Google pretty easily, but it's the structure and the accountability that we put in place, right?
That's really well said, Justin. And I would just say, to add to that we've been talking about deadlines. And I think that that's something that's just underappreciated, has not been talked about in a just common sense way by a lot of this field. But there's another aspect to strictness that I think is worth discussing, which is just about kind of like grade inflation, or what is the standard that you need to meet in order to pass the class.
Yeah, you say in the paper, Adam, that a lot of people think of grade inflation as a victimless crime, but it's really not.
That's right. There's research that goes back decades, but I've also done some of this research myself with collaborators, Seth Gershenson, Stephen Holt, who are economists. And our paper, for example, looked at math courses in high school, and we looked at how strict of a grader the teachers were. And so there's variation in how strict the teachers are at grading. Are they giving up that A really easily, or do you really have to go above and beyond to get it? And the way that we can measure that is we know the students' attendance records, and we know how they did on their end of course exam, which every North Carolina student has to take. And then we can compare that to the grades that they take home. And then we can look at teachers, and the teacher who has students who are failing the end of course exam and showing up to class, they're chronically absent, they're not showing up to class very much either, and then they're getting A's. We know that teacher is not having real high grading standards, as opposed to a teacher who may be giving a B for a student who's doing really well on the end of course exam at the end and is showing up to class all the time, right? That's just kind of a stylized examples because it's a statistical model, but that's the basic idea, is that we can measure how strict of a grader the teacher is. And what we learn is that students learn more when they have a stricter grading teacher. And we're not the only ones to find this. There's a study, I think David Figlio did it in Florida in elementary schools. There's been a couple of other studies as well that have looked at this, and they find that the teachers who have higher grading standards, that is, they're stricter, they're tougher graders, their students tend to learn more. And so it's really important, not just the deadlines, but also what's the expectation here? Are we giving every student an A, or every student an A or a B? Like the good students get the A's and the less good students get the B's. I think there's a lot of places where that's the point that we've gotten to. If you look at the grade inflation environment, this has changed a lot in the last few years. People have been complaining about grade inflation also since like the dawn of time. But the truth is that in the last few years, we've hit a kind of new territory where like ACT had a report last year or the year before where they showed that the ACT scores were the lowest on record and the GPAs were the highest on record. We also have the GPA not being as good of a predictor, at least in elite academic context, as it used to be. It used to be that GPA was almost always the best predictor of post-secondary success, better than test scores. That is not the case, at least for elite colleges now. And it's one reason why they have to bring back the SAT and the ACT. Some of the places that got rid of that for a little while are bringing it back because GPA is not very predictive anymore, at least in those contexts.
Well, and how could it be if everybody gets an A, right?
Absolutely. That's exactly what's happening. And then you've got to think about it, not just from those institutional perspectives, but also for parents and for students. Although I think for parents, it's even worse. I think students are kind of aware of the grade environment, but parents are thinking about the grade environment that was the situation when they were in school, which was decades earlier, right? And so as grade inflation happens, then their students are taking home all Bs, and they think that's great. Yeah, pretty good grades. That's better than I got when I was in school, right? They're going to pass and everything, and they're not even getting Cs. And they don't know that the median grade is an A and that their student is actually doing worse than almost everyone else in their classroom. Learning Heroes has done really great work on this as an organization that helps connect with parents and helps them to understand what's going on in their kids' report cards and everything. And they've shown that 90% of parents think that their kid is on grade level, when the actual number is somewhere between 25 and 50%, is nowhere near the 90%. So this is a real breakdown when we have all this grade inflation, when we have low standards for students. And this is directly, associated with some aspects of the equitable grading movement, which, we're giving you 50 instead of 0 on every assignment. That is just automatic grade inflation. It's just making it harder to tell whether a student is really performing well or if they're performing mediocre, or if they really need a bunch of extra resources and help to get where they need to go.
And there's kind of a fundamental issue here that we've been addressing in a way, and that is whether grades should only reflect mastery or, the learning itself, or whether grades should also reflect effort in some way. And I thought this was interesting because you have a chart on page 18 that reveals a bit of a contradiction in teachers' views. And overwhelmingly, teachers do want the option to include things like participation and homework in grades. And yet, when the survey asked them directly, only 36% of teachers said that grades should be based partly on effort. And the alternative there was that grades should be based on objective standards as opposed to effort. Talk to us a little bit about that kind of contradictory finding there, that there are these two ideas that we're trying to keep in our heads here, that yes, your grades shouldn't just be, everybody gets a gold star. You actually have to learn stuff to get good grades, but also, should effort be factored into grades? Take us into that, a little bit of that contradiction.
I think it's something that a lot of the field is struggling with right now to try to understand it. Was that final grade supposed to be essentially just duplicative of what a very high quality standardized test or some assessment like that at the end of the term would show you? Or is it supposed to be more holistic? Should it have things like participation and your effort and whether you turned your homework in on time? Should that be a part of your grade too? And I think for a lot of people, I've spoken with teachers who are very passionate that they think it really should just be based on what you know at the end of the term. That's what a grade should mean. And I've also talked to people who believe that the whole reason that grades have been the best predictor of your future performance is because they incorporate more than just your, say, cognitive skill and whether you really mastered this material, which is a very important part of it, but maybe not the only part of school, right? Showing up is an important part. Collaborating is important. Participating is important. And so I think that this is just a tension. I think some teachers see this one way, some see it the other way. And I don't think that it necessarily has much to do with, being lenient or being strict. I think that there are people who are promoters of standards-based grading or mastery grading who are really trying to fight grade inflation. and who are holding their students, accountable strictly to those, standards. And that's the way that they're doing it. And, but I do worry a little bit about the idea that only your final knowledge can really count in the grade because of what we were talking about earlier around deadlines. I really think it's important that the student is not just faced with, 6 months from now, you need to know a bunch of stuff. And, if you figure out that we're not really grading anything, nothing really counts until then, that you might just procrastinate. And I worry about that. I do think that there are teachers who are solving that in other ways. And so I think it's important to make sure that we're talking about the implementation here and the way that the teachers are doing this. Our purpose with this report was really to elevate teachers' perspectives, to show, yes, I think, what we found is that teachers are quite skeptical of a lot of these policies, but the real takeaway for me is that administrators need to be really careful about removing tools from teachers, like saying you can't include participation in your student's grade. Now, most teachers thought that having some participation grades is good, but there are teachers out there who don't like that and think there are other ways to get students to participate rather than taking it into the grade. And that is totally legitimate within the context, of balancing all of these different types of incentives and accountability and classroom management. As long as they're thinking about those and making sure that it's working for their class, that's legitimate. But what's really scary is when we get, PD providers going into districts convincing the administrators, don't let any of your teachers grade homework anymore or grade participation anymore, or they're taking away a lot of the tools that teachers have used to hold their students accountable. And I just really think that that is likely to backfire. And it really deserves the kind of derision and controversy that it has prompted in a lot of the places that have tried to implement some of this stuff from the top down in districts.
Yeah, it's been really interesting to see how standards-based grading has been a part of that, with the rationale that we're more accurately reporting on student mastery. Like, it sounds like an improvement, but I think you touched on this, that typically when this happens, what we're seeing is grade inflation, right? The learning as measured by reliable tests goes down and the grades go up. So something is fishy about this idea that we're like just measuring learning, and we're taking away so many tools from teachers. And like, the cynical part of me has to say, wait a minute, is this just a way for districts to look better, to like hire a consultant to justify the inflation of our grades so we look better? Even if our test scores are worse, our grades look good, our graduation rates look good, and that's what we're accountable for. So that's kind of how, to me, that seems like how we kind of got where we are.
Well, I think that mastery grading or standards-based grading, I think there's variation there, Justin. I don't think that you're always seeing grades going up. In fact, I think in some places, you're probably seeing the fact that you're attaching these qualitative labels to the grade as opposed to ABC grades might actually help reset some of the expectations that have perpetuated grade inflation in some places. So I think that you're right. That's probably happening in a lot of places, but I do think there are probably places that are implementing this in a really thoughtful way. And I don't want to say those teachers are necessarily wrong for trying that, as long as they're thinking through all of this stuff. On the other hand, the issue you raise with administrators is really worth underlining, because administrator incentives here are kind of poorly aligned to student learning and to holding students accountable. In a lot of cases, we have held administrators accountable largely for passing students, for getting graduation rates up. When that is the main thing that they're being held accountable for in terms of student learning, it is really incentivizing them to find ways to make it easier for students to pass. And I have to say, that cynical side of you, I think you're homing in on something that is really a problem. I had one superintendent email me a couple of months ago, and they sent me a justification he found on the internet that was from a university or some kind of educational institution that was done by researchers, where they were showing different grading scales and saying that, justifying minimum grading and 0 to 4 grading. The entire point was that if you had two students who had the same performance on their assessments or their grade or their homework assignments, that if you switch to the 0 to 4 grading, the student would get a B, and in this other case, the student would get a C or something. They said that makes it more oriented towards success. That's a direct quote. And so, oriented towards success, that sounds nice, but what you're really saying is that the student did the same amount of work, did the same level of performance, and you just handed them a higher grade. That's the definition of grade inflation. And so I think that administrators, unfortunately, need to think, they need to really think clearly about what is it that we're incentivizing in our district? And is there a way for me to get the teachers and the departments together to help devise some other measures so that we can have measures of student success in our school or our district that really measure their learning and their growth and are not just about passage or getting more students past the class or getting those marginal students across, even if they're not learning more. We've had the same problem with credit recovery programs around the country, where there's a lot of just getting students to kind of click through some modules so we can say that the student completed a core course that they actually failed, and they're not really learning anything, but the administrators are getting credit then for them passing. And absent some external validation of student learning, which we do have in some cases, like in North Carolina, we have end of course assessments for Algebra 1, like I was just talking about. They also have them for geometry and Algebra 2. In some fields, that's a good check on everybody. It really adds some transparency to what students are actually learning. And you can make these kind of calculations of how many students are passing the algebra end of course exam and how many are failing but still getting really good grades, and what's going on in our district. I think that at the end of the day is the kind of thing that really helps add transparency and change the incentives. But in the short term, I think administrators have got to fight the good fight and not give into the temptation to try to lower standards and make their numbers look better.
And as you said, that's tough because the incentives that they face are poorly aligned with learning. I love the way you said that earlier, that the incentives are just not well aligned. And teachers see this, right? I think that was a lot of the wisdom of doing this survey, is that teachers see these issues very clearly because they can see in real time, my students are slacking off after they realize they can't possibly fail even if they don't do any work. They realize my students are procrastinating because they have these unlimited retakes and no deadlines and all of that. So they can see pretty quickly whether these policies are good or bad for students. But the accountability for the other decision makers tends to be a little bit delayed for administrators who might be rewarded for getting graduation rates up, but certainly for consultants who talk about equity, who give good branding about equity, and aren't really held accountable for the impact on learning. So I have to have some harsh words here for the consultants who have not really worried about that and just said, hey, this is going to be good. This is going to be a good thing. What do you see as the responsibility of consultants who are pushing some of these kind of unproven changes?
Well, I think one of the big problems is that they've been advocating for district-wide policies. And I am a lot less concerned about some of these. First of all, some of the equitable grading reforms are good. I like the idea of using rubrics where that's workable. There may be some cases where that's not, but we know there's anti-Black bias in grading, for example. David Quinn is a scholar who has done really great work on this. He's done experimental work showing that if you just have a grading artifact, like a thing that looks like an assignment, and you change it says, my brother, Colin, in one of them, and it says it's the exact same thing that researchers manipulated. It says my brother Colin on one artifact, and the other homework assignment it says my brother Dante. That Dante's brother, not a real person, right? It's just the researchers have created these, but quote unquote Dante's brother gets lower grades from teachers. Teachers have a systemic anti-Black bias in that sense. It doesn't necessarily apply to all teachers, but in the aggregate, that's what David Quinn found. And what he also found is that if you implement a grading rubric, the bias disappears. There's also bias towards other categories of students. And so I think getting rid of bias is good. Making grading fair is better. And some of the proposals have been good. But the concern is when we have district-wide policies that lower standards and expectations for students, and district-wide policies that remove the ability of teachers to hold students accountable for showing up, participating, doing their homework, turning in things on time, and even doing the assignment at all in the case of giving them 50% when they didn't turn in an assignment. Those policies lower standards, they lower expectations for students, and I don't think any district ought to be implementing that from the top down. If a teacher or a department wants to experiment with some of those, that's not such a bad idea, because they can always react and say, this isn't working for us, or this is working for us, or we need this other thing to complement it. That's a lot more workable. But when you have these like district-wide mandates that say you can no longer grade, impose late penalties on anything, that's just a terrible idea that it's understandable why so many teachers dislike it.
So the report is Equitable Grading Through the Eyes of Teachers. Adam, if people want to learn more about some of the research you do at Fordham, where's the best place for them to go online?
Yeah, they should go to fordhaminstitute.org. We have a website with all of our research reports. We put out new research about every month or so. We have a new research report coming out on a variety of topics related to education policy in the country. We have our own podcast. We have a blog. So they can sign up. They can check us out there at fordhaminstitute.org. And we'd love to hear from anybody, teachers, principals, or any of your audience who's had questions about this stuff or has a reaction to any of our work on grading policy or anything else. We'd love to hear from them.
Well, Adam, thank you for elevating the voices of teachers, and thank you for joining me today on Principal Center Radio. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me, Justin.
Thanks for listening to Principal Center Radio. For more great episodes, subscribe on our website at principalcenter.com/radio.